This is a talk I've been giving for a little while, but mostly to visitors from overseas. It's not intended to tell you whether we should be in or out of Brexit or even what's going to happen in the coming weeks, although it's a framework for thinking about some of the issues which might give you a lead into those questions, and we can talk about that in some Q&A if you wish. So I'm not going to use slides because it's hardly visual at all, but there's really four areas I want to cover. What's the background to the European Union which is making this so difficult? Why is it particularly difficult for the UK? How does that play into why the negotiations have been so difficult? And then what does all of this mean for London as a financial centre, which was the original reason I started talking about it. So I think we have to go back to the point that the European Union is all about ever closer union between the countries of Europe. That has been a driving force for the countries of Europe to come closer together, really to, not just to encourage trade, but to encourage peace in Europe. That path for ever closer union seems to me almost inevitably is going to end up in a single country of Europe of some kind, either a federal state or something similar. And I think that's why the path for the UK is so difficult. When people say, should we be in or out, nearly all the Remain campaigners I speak to do not want to be part of a single country in Europe. And so if that is the path down which the EU goes, there is always going to be a difficult point for the UK at some point if it does not want to proceed to become part of a single country in Europe. And British foreign policy for hundreds of years has been not to have a single country in Europe. So this has been a long-standing view. Maybe in another 20 years or so there would have been enough reform in the European Union that people's minds would have changed. They would want to be part of a single country in Europe. But that means a single currency, it means free movement of people, fully sharing budget contributions, which is not where we're currently at now. Okay, so this is always going to be difficult. We didn't need to ask the question now, but we would have to have asked the question at some point if the EU proceeds down the path towards fuller integration. Now, why should the EU continue to go down that road? And I think there's two fundamental reasons. The first of all is, at the moment, there is not a single European government that is directly elected. And you put the question another way, is it possible to vote out the European government? Right? In a democracy, you can argue the only important thing about democracy is that every now and again you get a chance to vote the government out. You cannot vote out the EU government because there isn't one. You have the Commission, which are basically very powerful civil servants, but civil servants. You have the Parliament, which is more like a reforming chamber to legislation that is going through. And you have the Council, which are the nominations by the countries. Okay, now, these things can all change. Very difficult for the electorate across the EU to have a say in those. I don't think that's sustainable. I think at some point there will have to be a directly elected European government. And in fact, I'm not sure that even the euro can survive if you do not have a single political entity and financial entity behind it. Very difficult to have fiscal union if you don't have a political union first. And the monetary union without fiscal and political union is always going to be a risky business. And that's long been known. That's been argued for 50 years or more. Okay, so I think that's the political reason, and that will play into the negotiations part somewhat. A second reason, as an economist, I step back and look at this, and I see some real economic problems across Europe. And I was looking, for example, at the difference in unemployment rates. Germany has an unemployment rate of 3.4. UK, Great Britain, this is from June this year, Great Britain was 4.1%. But France is at over 9%, Italy 10, nearly 11, Spain 15, Greece 20. So big differences in unemployment rates across Europe. And that's partly because European countries find it very difficult to take important decisions about the supply side of their economies. Now, the supply side is fundamental to economic growth, fundamental to determining unemployment. And at the moment, it's very easy for countries, national countries, to simply blame Europe for everything, even when it is the local country's policies which are the reason. So, with respect to Isabella and France, France has chosen not to have a low-wage economy with lots of people in temporary employment and part-time working. That's been a political choice. It's basically being said they only want full-time, well-paid jobs. And that is why they have 9% unemployment. And we do know how to fix high unemployment these days. It's been fixed in the UK and Germany, and the US never really got there. But France has chosen not to adopt those policies. But at least that's a choice in France. In southern European countries, they have not even considered the hard choices that would have to be made to reduce those unemployment rates. And as I say, we know roughly what the policies look like to do that. They simply blame Europe. And I don't think that's tenable. You can't run a democracy with 15, 20% unemployment rates. I don't think that's sustainable. Eventually, those countries would elect to leave if unemployment stays that high. So I think there are good economic reasons why you either have to break the EU up so that each country takes responsibility for its own actions, or you centralise power. And you have a tough central government which can make these decisions across Europe. Every time a decision is coming up at the moment, centralisation is the result, rightly so. I think that's the right way for Europe to go. So we now have the single bank supervisors, the SSM, which is a huge improvement over the system of national regulators we had before, where people basically favoured their own flagships, their own national banks, which can't happen with the SSM. We have free movement of people. We have a single recovery and resolution directive now within Europe, and there are countless other examples of that. So that's the direction of travel for Europe. And I think this would always, at some point, have been a problem for the UK, because we have been basically opting out. And as Europe continues to come together towards political and economic union, the UK would probably continue to opt out. And the thing is, at the moment, and even before Brexit, we're not fully in the European Union. We're only half in. We have opted out of the Schengen Area Agreement. We've opted out of the SSM. We opted out of the euro currency, and so on. And I have to say, other countries in Europe hated us for this, because we were basically cherry-picking the bits of Europe we liked and the bits of Europe we didn't like. So what did the UK want? What the UK always wanted is access to the single market for free trade, and didn't want everything else, which sounds very rational and good. But from the European perspective, if you have somebody with access to the European market and they don't get all the other stuff that goes with that, like employment protection, environmental protection, health and safety, all those additional costs which Europe imposes, it's not free trade from the European point of view. And so they do not want a country to have access to the single market, but complete freedom to determine everything about its labour market and so on. Okay? So the UK position, which sounds very good and natural to us, is not acceptable to the other side. And that, I think, you can see where some of this is going to go in terms of the negotiations. So we do have some fundamental differences with Europe. And when people said to me before the referendum, well, should we be in or out, I found it difficult to give an answer, because my natural instinct is to say, yes, we should be in, we should be part of a single country in Europe. But I could see that at some point, 20, 30 years down the road, it was almost inevitable that the UK either had to be part of a single country or leave. I can't see how the UK would ever have a majority in a referendum for being part of a single country with the euro and everything else. Maybe there would be enough reform, or maybe today's youngsters grow old and would change the opinion in the country. So I would have said 20 or 30 years maybe we could have addressed it. Now, how does all this play into the negotiations? Well, part of the problem, of course, is we haven't really been having a set of negotiations about the principles of a future deal for the UK, because we've been negotiating between the UK government and the European Commission. We haven't been negotiating with the European government, because there isn't one to negotiate with. All the Europeans can do is set out their rules and say, if you want access to the single market, these are the rules you have to sign up to. And so there hasn't really been a negotiation over the future trade relationship between the UK and the EU, as far as I can see. And it's impossible to see how we could get one, certainly not from within. The Commission can't. The Commission's just been given a set of red lines by the political leaders, and that's all they can discuss. And so what we have in the draft agreement is a problem, because it very explicitly is not a deal. It is not a deal about the future relationship of the UK and the EU, nor within that position of Northern Ireland. I don't know why everybody calls it a deal. I do wonder, I don't know if, is there any members of the press here? Yes. I do wonder how many people have actually read the 585-page draft agreement or gone through it. I did. On the day after it came out, I sat and lived through it, because I was going off to Brussels in the afternoon, and I knew somebody would ask me about it. It says very explicitly there is no agreement yet on the future trade arrangements on Northern Ireland. Okay. So most of that text is simply an exit text, which is fine. We need an exit text. And most of it, you can argue about whether you like it or not. That's fair enough, or whether the amount of money is the right amount of money or not. But the problem is, it's not just an exit text, because there's some poison pills dropped into it, which says in just a few words that if there is no agreement on trade on Northern Ireland by the middle of 2020, the UK and Northern Ireland will remain in a customs union with the EU. Now, I was reading some of the headlines that were coming out this morning from the government's legal advice, and there's these flash headlines saying Britain could get stuck in a customs union with the EU. You don't need legal advice to tell you that. It's written in the text. That's just what the text says. And so what you've got is a transition out text with some poison pills dropped in. And I can't see how there possibly can be an agreement on the future trade relationship between the UK and the EU, nor on Northern Ireland. Because what the UK wants is access to the single market without all the attendant rules. That is not what is acceptable to the EU, because they want, if you're inside the single market, you have to accept all the rules. And so I cannot see, we could go out and start negotiating bilaterally over individual markets, tariffs and things like that. We could negotiate a separate trade deal. That might take 10 years. It's certainly not going to be done by the middle of 2020. And so as the text stands, I can't see any other outcome than that those backstop clauses, which the press were told were there to make sure there was a deal, and they were designed never to be triggered. Actually, it looks likely to me that that's exactly what the outcome would be. Now, some people may be happy than that, but I think most observers, both those who would like to remain in and those who would like to leave, think that would be a worse outcome than the opposite point of view. Okay? And the point is, we were only half in. You cannot conceivably go from being half in to being half out. It doesn't make any sense. Because half out, it means you're subject to exactly the same rules, but you just don't have a say over them. So that's clearly preferable to stay in, if that's where you're going to end up with. And if you're going to leave, as somebody who would like to stay in, if we were going to leave, we should leave, right? We shouldn't be tied into a set of rules we have no say over. To me, it's a binary choice of either stay in or leave, not this funny mixture. But I can understand why the negotiations have ended here, because the problem of Northern Ireland also has no solution. It seems to me either, if we leave the EU, then you either have a trade border between Northern Ireland and the south, or you have to have a trade border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. I can't see at the moment any economic fudge which is going to get around having one of those two choices. And since each choice is a red line against one of the communities in Northern Ireland, we're stuck with that. And so I don't see how there can be, by negotiation, a solution to that problem by mid-2020. So at the moment, what we have is a draft Brexit exit tract, which is fine from my point of view, with some poison pills in it, which will probably see it voted down in the House of Commons. I don't know. An MP told me that he thought the government was 70 votes short. I suspect that's an exaggeration, but it might not be. But the reason why we can't proceed very much further with negotiations is because there isn't a political entity, a political body on the other side with which the UK can have a sensible negotiation. That's the problem we have. And unless we could negotiate directly with other governments, I don't see how you can resolve these fundamental issues around trade and Northern Ireland. So I don't know where that leaves us in terms of what's going to happen. But the second part of the talk, and I'm running through this quite quickly because I think Q&A will be much more interesting for you. The reason I originally got into this topic was people asked me what's going to be the future for London as a financial centre given Brexit. And here I have to stand back and say, what are the advantages of London as a financial centre? And there's quite a few. The English language is a big advantage. The time zone is a big advantage. English law is a huge advantage. People like to issue contracts under English law because they know pretty much they will get fair treatment between the different parties to those contracts under English law. That would not happen necessarily in New York, where the courts tend to favour the American participants in any contract. And it wouldn't happen necessarily in other countries. So English law is quite a big advantage. And London is a truly international financial centre. And what I mean by that is two things. First of all, it is not about the UK and sterling. If you go to New York, in my view, it's all about dollar markets and the US economy and those economies that trade with the US. If you go to Tokyo, it's all about Japanese markets and the yen. That's obviously not the case in London, where sterling is a relatively small part of the overall business. And a test on this is that if you look at the big 6 UK domestic banks, domestically operating banks, 4 of them have overseas nationals as chief executive. Okay? Jess Staley at Barclays, Ross McEwen at RBS, and Bill Winters at Standard Chartered, although they don't, to be fair, they don't really do business in the UK, they're more overseas, and Antonio Horta-Osorio at Lloyds. And of the other 2 banks, actually one of them is Spanish, Santander. And HSBC, to be fair, they've always thought of themselves from Hong Kong, certainly Stuart Gulliver did. So that's what an international financial centre looks like. It's not focused on the UK, you did not give advantage to UK nationals. And if you go to, when I was in Japan giving this same talk, they were talking about how they would make Tokyo the centre for Far Eastern markets. And so a couple of questions. Is it conceivable that a big Japanese bank could have a CEO who was not Japanese? No, that was ruled out. Is it conceivable the Japanese authorities would allow branches of Chinese banks to operate in Tokyo? Oh, no, that would not be, that would be going to, we do in London. And so I think a lot of people don't understand what it takes to make an international financial centre, which is that you have to welcome the whole world into your place and let them trade freely. It doesn't matter, you mustn't show national favouritism. And around the different centres in Europe at the moment who would compete for London business, a lot of them do show that national favouritism, which is why international players would rather not set up shop there. So I think London still has these fundamental advantages. However, European Union rules being what they are, some business will have to move into Europe in order to service European clients. But that's true in many cases. It can be quite difficult to service US clients if you're not US based or have special reasons. They say about 6,000 jobs are moving. What people forget, though, is some of this was happening even before the Brexit referendum. The creation of the single supervisory mechanism meant that all the big players wanted a supervisory relationship with the SSM. And so they were already looking to establish enough of a presence within the Eurozone so that you could have something, an entity supervised by the SSM. Okay, so that trend was already in place. And it's impossible now to distinguish how much of the move that's happening is because of the SSM being created and how much is because of Brexit. But it's going to be messy. At the moment, I think what a lot of the the investment banks are planning to do is keep their risk management in London, do whatever trades they need to in Europe, and then back-to-back the risk management into London. That still happens, I believe, with quite a lot of Asian trade. The risk management for quite a lot of Asian deals is done in London. And when I was in the PRA, we were actually a bit concerned about that. We thought the risk management might be better done were it close to the jurisdiction in which the trades were done. So we weren't entirely happy with that. I think the Japanese thought the same, but it was a cost question for the banks. So various jobs will move to Europe. I can't see people moving lock, stock and barrel unless they absolutely have to. Because if you're in a country whose first language is not English, you'll have to complete all your tax and your financial accounts, most likely in the local language. That's the cost. You'll have to get people to live there. Some places are very nice. Paris would be a very nice city to live in. Frankfurt, I spent a whole week in Frankfurt early in the year. Not very attractive. If you're the spouse of a wealthy international investment banker, do you really want to live in Frankfurt? Notice I didn't say wife because it could equally well be a man, but Frankfurt isn't a great place to be. But the real question for me is there really a threat to London from the creation from Britain leaving the EU? And I think that's not really the threat we should be worried about. There are a number of existential threats out there which are much more serious for London in the longer run, and Brexit will appear like a blip on that path. So the real big issue is whether business moves to the Far East, because that's where the growing financial business is taking place, where people are making most of their money. And if I was going to have to move my headquarters, I would not be moving it to a European city, I'd be moving it somewhere to the Far East if that's where my business was. A second big risk is that of cyber attack. Most of our big institutions are getting attacked on a daily basis, often through state-sponsored agents operating, continually trying to check out the defences. That is a very big risk which is going on in the background. And the other risk is that the banks themselves will get completely disintermediated, potentially, in over 20, 30 years by new technology companies coming in and taking that business away. And in Europe, we have 80% of credit provided by banks. In America, it's roughly the other way around, with capital markets playing a much bigger role. So Europe is probably overbanked. And if I was a banker in Europe, I'd be more worried about that existential threat from possibly being disintermediated than I would about whether we're inside or outside Europe. So my conclusion on that is that UK leaving the EU would be messy for London. It would be costly. It would also be messy and costly for the EU because most of that business a lot of London's business cannot currently be done from within the EU. And the EU's rules don't make it very easy because they are not oriented towards international access in the same way that the UK's are. So it would be bad for both sides. It's a lose-lose in that sense. But I don't think it's fundamental. I don't think it's going to, in the foreseeable future, cause London to shrink very much as a financial centre. I think there's these other risks that are out there which we ought to be much more focused on. And one of the big costs of Brexit for the UK has been the political attention that's been focused on Brexit rather than a lot of other issues which may actually be much more important in the long run. And some of you know, for example, that I've been working a lot on climate change and the financial risks from that. And it's quite clear that we've had no new legislation for a long time on that, very little money, partly because all the attention and focus has been on Brexit. It's been very difficult to get any new legislation for about 2 years that's not Brexit related. So there we have it. We have a problem where Europe is going down a track which the UK most likely would never have wanted to end up at the same place. And so at some point, even if you wanted to remain in the EU now, there would be this fundamental question of did we take the jump to be in Europe as a part of a single country or not? And if you ask that question today, it's quite clear what the answer is. A bit less clear what would happen in 20 or 30 years' time. We've got a big problem with there being currently no European government. That's a fundamental democratic deficit, but it's also a problem for the negotiations because it's very hard for us to negotiate with the disparate entities that form the current EU administration. So that, I think, is why we haven't made any progress. And we have a draft agreement, which is, for me, a no-deal deal, which has got these poison pills in it, which will most certainly mean it gets voted down. So basically, we're in a bit of a mess if that happens, because I can't see what's going to happen should the agreement get voted down. Unless they just try passing it without the poison pills about what the outcome of the negotiations is. But that's the backstop which the government has promised the Northern Irish MPs. So it's going to be very difficult for them to accept the dropping of those backstops. So there we have it. That's my text for today. But I'm happy to open the floor to Q&A and see what other people think.
Paul? Yeah. Forgive me, this is more of a political than an economic question, because you referred... So I'm quite loud, actually. You referred earlier, or you referred consistently, to the consistent move, as you see it, of Europe towards a federalised or one-country entity. I'm wondering, and you also mentioned just in passing the attacks which regularly occur to operations in the city from, quote, state-sponsored players. We put a name to those state-sponsored players and we ask, do you think that the process of, let's call it federalisation in Europe, will be hastened or halted by the increasing animosity of Russia?
I'm not on the inside of those discussions, but it seems quite possible that Russia has been playing some sort of role in the background to encourage the thoughts and considerations of Brexit. I don't know if that's true or not, but obviously from a Russian point of view, a breakup of the European Union will clearly be preferred to a big, strong European country. So I think they would certainly have an interest in the outcome. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if they were playing some role. But it's very difficult to pin the agents we know who are doing the attacks back to the countries. I mean, people can assert who they belong to, but it's very difficult to provide that proof in public. And often the monies are channeled through different groups, so you think you know who's sponsoring it. But so I wouldn't want to name names, but people will be able to work that out for themselves. Somebody must disagree with things I've been saying, so that would be great. Yeah.
Paul, you said that the UK probably doesn't want to go in the same direction as a single unified European state, and I think you're that's definitely right, given history, given popular view. But you do seem very convinced that that is the direction of Europe, come what may. What challenges do you think there might be, either as a result of Brexit or as a result of external pressures or as a result of internal differences, particularly between Northern and Southern Europe, towards that unification?
Yeah, I think there's, to be fair, nobody knows exactly what's going to happen. So I think there are three outcomes here. I think one outcome is that Europe breaks up to a larger or greater extent. Another outcome is that there is a union. And of course, the union may become more likely if some countries leave. It may become more likely if the UK leaves, actually. And you had a sort of a core group that came together. You could have that. The alternative is you muddle on as now. And I just think if you muddle on as now, sooner or later there will be triggers, and you have to decide: do we have more integration? Do we break up? And I think you just keep on. Every time it's happened, every few years, at the moment, you end up with more integration. I'm not sure that what we've got is a stable resting place, but you can muddle on for quite a long time. But I think it would mean probably quite slow growth, because I can't see the current European Union model driving the sort of dynamic changes through particularly Southern Europe that those economies need in order to restore growth and bring unemployment down. I think that's why I'd link it back, the politics back to the economics all the time. If the government is not strong enough, it's quite a difficult job in government to allow supply-side changes which create a dynamic economy. People tend to think of the economy as being a static thing, but it's not. It's constantly changing. There are always industries declining and new industries growing. The increase in employment you expect is the difference between a lot of people becoming unemployed and a lot more people getting jobs. So, for example, in France, just use them as an example, I know they have a lot of restrictions making it difficult to sack people. And that means that employers are very reluctant to hire people. And I've sat in French restaurants where they're clearly understaffed. And you think, well, that's because if they take on workers, they can't release them if the demand isn't there. So you don't get that sort of casual labour you get in the UK. Otherwise, why aren't all the Polish and Romanian visitors working in France in temporary jobs? Why do they come here? But I just don't see how this is sustainable in the long run. Eventually, you're going to have problems. You're going to have problems funding social security, problems funding pensions, for sure. An interesting thing is most of Europe does not have pre-funded pension schemes like the UK and the Dutch and the Danes do. In Germany, for example, they have a book reserve entry scheme, which means basically pay as you go with a backstop insurance arrangement. Probably makes it cheaper, but there's going to be a problem funding, say, French pensions if they stay with 9% unemployment at the current sort of levels. So you can just see these problems building and building. And the thing you know about economic problems is that eventually they get you. Eventually, governments can't keep spending a lot more money than they receive in tax revenue or funding without it becoming a problem. You just never know exactly when that problem is going to hit. So that's where I say, but no, maybe I'm wrong, maybe they'll just muddle on. But if they muddle on without real reform, I think it will lead to a slow economy and unemployment remaining high in a lot of countries, and that's where the risks come from. Isabel.
I interpret your speech as that you don't believe at all in a soft exit. It has to be hard exit.
Yeah, I think either we stay in, which would be my preference, or we leave. We need a transition text out, and we've got probably that within the draft agreement, but we shouldn't have these backstop arrangements in there, because I think the problems of future trade in Northern Ireland are basically unsolvable, and we have to bite that bullet and say we don't know what the answers are. It's no good putting in saying, oh, we're going to agree in the next 18 months. So I would have a clear preference ordering, and I think nearly everybody else has that same preference ordering, and what we've got on the table at the moment is the third most popular of three options, which I suspect is why it's most likely to get voted down. The only reason it could go through, I think, is enough people got scared at the prospect of not having any transition text at all. That's the only chance of it getting through, which could happen. It depends what's going through MPs' minds. This is why I don't quite believe the figure of 70 MPs short, because when it gets close to it, minds will get focused and people will start deciding things on the basis of individual conscience. but it's not a great place to be in at the moment.
Thank you. Can I just pick up on the point about the hard border in Northern Ireland? While it might be, at the moment, politically unpalatable in some quarters, obviously there are countries around the world that have hard borders and still survive. Is it really that insurmountable? If you take away the politics out of it, is it really insurmountable to have a hard border?
I don't think so, because I think basically the UK doesn't have to impose a hard border. It will be a question for the EU what they put in place. But as I understand it, it was part of the Good Friday Agreement, peace agreement between the Unionists and the Republicans in Northern Ireland. And so if a hard border goes in, that you can argue that agreement is broken, and who then knows what the consequences are. And so it does go back to the peace process in Northern Ireland, I think, as to whether or not, what sort of acceptable outcome you could have. The trouble is you have a choice between two outcomes, it seems to me, neither of which is acceptable. But one of them is going to have to be the case if we leave. I just can't see how anybody thinks there is room for a third way that nobody has spotted up till this point, but somehow they're going to magically arrive at in the next 18 months. That's why I think if left as it is, it's quite likely these poison pill triggers will get triggered, even though we're supposed to believe that they are designed never to be triggered. There's nothing in the text which says that, by the way. That was a spin that was put on the agreement when it was released. And it was interesting. There's nobody here from the Financial Times, is there? No. I read the Financial Times the morning after the thing had been released. They clearly could not have written that after the document was released. So the only way that could have been written was on the basis of briefing and documents they had been given before the document was released. Now that's normal practice to pre-release stuff. It did read to me as if they hadn't actually read the text. That would be my personal view. I don't know if that's true or not. But this is why I wonder how many people have actually read the 585-page text. I can forgive people for not reading it. It's pretty boring. But most of the stuff, there's some good stuff in there about the rights of citizens, about the budget, about Gibraltar, about Cyprus. All of that seems to me perfectly acceptable. You could argue it should be one way or the other. But the bit on trade and Northern Ireland is actually very, very short. So you can just jump in and find that bit. You get everything you need to know. Eda.
Paul, do you think nobody really thought about the ramifications for Northern Ireland? You know, when this whole Brexit referendum was in its creation and infancy, because it doesn't seem, and I'm a bit biased being Irish, but given the importance of it for both Northern Ireland and the Republic and the peace process and the whole Good Friday Agreement, it just seems bizarre that this was never part of the conversation from the very beginning, if you think of the debates on either side of the argument.
Well, the problem is the debate was really a very bad one. And interestingly, I found on my desk, I'll use my props now, these documents. Anybody recognise these? From circa 1974. Things that came through everybody's letterbox saying vote no or yes to join the EU. These documents, very short and to the point, seem to be better than anything I've seen in the debate on whether we should stay in the referendum now. And these were sent to every household. So, and the arguments are still the same, by the way. They haven't really changed very much. So you could probably have reissued these. And interestingly, they didn't have a date. I think they published these without actually knowing what the date of the referendum was going to be. But it's quite instructive. Of course, they didn't think they would lose the referendum. So that was one thing. And then when Mrs May called a general election, she didn't think she was going to lose a majority and have to have the Irish supporter in Parliament, which I think has brought the Northern Ireland problem perhaps more to the fore than it would otherwise have been. I don't think we would have had all this talk of backstops and things if it hadn't been for the fact that the government lost its majority. And it's an issue. I was looking at Brexit jokes online, and they're not very funny, unfortunately. But the one that did strike me was a Northern Irishman, a Welshman, a Scotsman, an Englishman going to a bar. The Englishman decides to leave, so they all have to. That's one of the better ones.
Excuse me, in answer to the lady's question, I seem to recall at the time around the referendum, Brexiteers were arguing that the Northern Ireland border situation would be easily sorted out by technology.
Yes. Yes, there's been a lot of assertions along that line. The other thing is, if you want to laugh, is to go and read the Chequers Agreement in its original text. Because I spoke to some officials from Europe after the referendum, and they said there is no way we're going to allow the UK to cherry pick what it wants and doesn't want from Europe. And the day after the Chequers Agreement came out, this was the headline from the Evening Standard from a French minister. No. Because she said basically it's exactly what the UK was trying to do in the Chequers Agreement. And I read the Chequers Agreement as I get fussed about going back to read the original documents, and it exactly is a cherry-picking agreement. It's saying we would like these things from Europe, we don't want these things from Europe. We realise that's going to be difficult, but that's our position. And so we've been negotiating on a basis which has always been completely unacceptable to the European governments. So I don't see that fundamental difference of opinion having changed at all as a result of the negotiations. I don't see how it could change, given where the two parties come from. Martin.
As far as I see it, somewhat from afar, this is like an entry into a maze, and at every turn there's a wall for whatever reason. And whether it's politically or economically, all I can see personally is a turnaround and, oh, can we get out, and can we have another vote?
Yeah.
And I have thought this for quite a long time, just because it's impossible to get any resolution.
I think it's perfectly possible. Time is running out, and it's going to be difficult if the opposition are not calling for one, because at the moment, suppose the bill, let's play a game of hypothesis. If the agreement gets voted down in Parliament, first of all, it's difficult to see how Mrs May could remain as Prime Minister, because she would have to go back to Brussels and try and renegotiate. I don't see that she would have a platform to do that. But I don't see how a general election helps if the opposition's platform is simply we'll try and renegotiate.
Well, I think that
So,
Corbyn has created some wriggle room here to in fact put in your manifesto an agreement on another referendum.
Yeah. So if they did that, it's possible. Until recently, until the draft agreement came out, though, the opinion polls for Remain and Leave were still very, very close. And given the amount of people who don't vote in the actual thing, the don't knows were smaller than the percentage of people who don't vote. So we could not have been confident about what the outcome of a new vote was. My understanding of the opinion polls is it's widened quite a bit since the agreement was released. So, yeah, in favour of Remain. And so, but you know, the polls looked like it was going to be a Remain outcome last time round until right at the end. So it's not clear that a new referendum would change it, but it's certainly possible. You certainly get a lot of very odd arguments that we can't have another referendum. Well, why not? There's nothing in the UK Constitution which said we had to have a referendum in the first place. There's nothing which said the Parliament had to accept the outcome, and there's no reason why you can't have another one. So, you know, that's still a possibility, but I think time is starting to run.